Hey everybody, I just want to go over a little bit about defining terrorism and the war on terrorism and some of the key concepts that are associated with our assignments for this week. And the two assignments for this week, the focus is really on chapter 1 of our text, but obviously it's important that you read all 3 chapters. The discussion board question this week is dealing with the war on terrorism and what is it. And then your short writing assignment for this week has you thinking about the impact that terrorism has had on your life. And we'll touch on that here in just a little bit, because I want to make sure that you really give that particular writing assignment some thought, because absent something more recent or personal regarding some level of terrorism, you may not be thinking of anything offhand that is going to be something that you might describe as how it's impacting your life, such as changing your patterns and your daily activities and stuff like that. So we're going to touch on that here a little bit closer as we get to the end. But I just want you to keep in mind that, defining a word such as terrorism is far more than an academic exercise. I mean, we really need to think about this concept and what this concept means today. What we will find out here shortly is that definitions of things change over time, and terrorism is one of those concepts that has changed over time in terms of what is and is not considered terrorism. Specifically, it means different things to different people. So to you, terrorism might mean X. To somebody in France, for example, it might mean Y. Or even to another classmate, you guys may have totally different ideas in terms of what is terrorism and how would that concept be defined. So just know that it is not an easy concept to try to define. And I'm going to go over some different definitions used by the FBI and obviously some definitions that are used by a couple of researchers in our textbook, just so you have an idea as to how this concept is defined by different parts of our national government and different types of researchers. Okay, so you can understand that there is maybe a common thread that runs through it, but each of those are slightly different than the other. Now, the nature of terrorism itself has changed over time. And in fact, if you have time this week, I have a short video in my announcement discussing some of the historical acts of terrorism, some of which you may never have heard of, some of which you have. But nonetheless, it gives you an idea as to the whole idea that terrorism has been around for thousands of years. We just may not have known it was terrorism at the time. But the idea of terrorism, based on its definition, is evident in some of the situations that are described in that short video. So hopefully, if you have time, you will watch that real short video on different acts of terrorism over history. So let's take a look at terrorism itself and how we're going to define it. Now, terrorism, in our book, describes it as a pejorative term. And pejorative means it expressing contempt or disapproval of something. So governments gain power when their enemies are called terrorists. So just recently, if you keep up with the news, President Trump re-identified North Korea as a terrorist state. In other words, they support terrorism and acts of terrorism and therefore are very dangerous to the United States of America. So the concept itself is used by government. And it does sort of give government more power if, in fact, they describe some group or, in some cases, a state as a terrorist state. And so, just something to keep in the back of your head as you begin reading through our chapters, or that if you somehow watch the news. So again, governments do gain power when their enemies are called terrorists, and citizens lose freedom in the name of greater security when the threat of terrorism appears. So this last concept, this last little part of my discussion here, that probably goes towards how has terrorism affected you personally. Because, obviously one goal of terrorist organizations is to reduce the democracy that we are all used to. In other words, impose more stringent standards on the government that affects that affects all of us. That is clearly evident, for example, if you travel. If you travel by airplane, the rigors of standing in line, having everything searched, patted down, being set aside for secondary screening. All those things, in essence, are a little bit of an infringement upon our freedoms. And then most of us elect to go through that because we'd rather travel by plane than by bus or train, or drive our personal car. But nonetheless, it is a level of intrusion into your personal freedom, something that we are very used to in this country. So as we begin to look at terrorism, one of the things you need to understand that terrorism is a social construct. And a social construct is defined as the way people view reality. Groups construct a framework around a concept, defining various aspects of their lives through the meaning they attribute to that construct. So, terrorism is a social construct. Terrorism is defined, in other words, by different people within vacillating social and political realities. So, you and I here in America may view something as terrorism, where somebody in another country will view an act and not view it as terrorism. And so next week we have you looking at, for example, media stories and how in one arena, let's say in America or Western society, it's classified as terrorism, but to another group it is not considered terrorism. And that's the purpose of that assignment, because we want you to get thinking about the fact that terrorism is a social construct, and that it's going to vary depending on who you are and where you are. And so, the fact that our government identifies certain acts that occur as terrorism, other countries may not look at it in the same context. Okay? So understand that terrorism is a social construct, and it's going to be based on the fact that different people within vacillating social and political realities have a different definition of that. The definition of any social construct changes with the social reality of the group providing the definition. The social construction of reality can be nebulous or can be threatening when one group imposes its version of reality on another. All right, so I think it's just very important just to understand that terrorism is defined by different people with different social and political realities. All right? Their backgrounds are different than ours. Their politics are different than ours. And so how one person views terrorism is not going to be the same as how another person views terrorism. Now, when we look at defining terrorism, there are a couple of ways in which we can look at it. Our book discusses several different researchers and theorists in terms of defining terrorism in terms of trying to get an understanding as to what it is, because it's important that we identify what terrorism is so we know what it is when we see it. Now, I'm just going to talk about two definitions. One is by LaCour and the other is by Gaynor. Now, LaCour says terrorism constitutes the illegitimate use of force to achieve a political objective by targeting innocent people. Also, attempts to move beyond the simple definition are fruitless because the term is so controversial. In other words, different people have different ideas on what is and is not terrorism. He also promotes a simple definition because the meaning of terrorism changes constantly as social contexts change. So as society changes, as society changes, what is considered terrorist today, tomorrow may not be considered a terrorist activity by a specific group, for example. Simple definition of terrorism includes three parts. Number one, the use of force. Number two, against innocent people. Number three, for political purposes. So I think the important difference between terrorism, for example, and a revolution is that in a revolution, groups fight the government, agents of the government, which is typically the military. Whereas in terrorism, groups target innocent people. That's their focus, because that brings fear, and that's what terrorists want, fear. In some level, to have you change your behavior, have the government change the rules so that maybe there are fewer freedoms that you and I enjoy. And so as these acts take place and the government has to respond, and oftentimes, as you are aware, policies change on how government deals with certain types of activities and situations. Okay. Gainer's another theorist, and Gainer believes that attacks on civilians is the key element differentiating terrorists from legitimate revolutionaries, which we just discussed. His focus is on non-combatant civilians. He says when civilians are the exclusive objects of attacks, the resulting actions are terrorism. Accordingly, he says, terrorism is a use or threatened use of violence against civilians or civilian targets to attain a political objective. Violence is the essence of terrorism. The aim is always political, and civilians are the targets. So those are two overviews of some theorists that have studied terrorism and how they would define the concept of terrorism. And obviously the key here is that it's the attack upon the civilian population and not necessarily the government. Here are a couple quick definitions associated with terrorism. One is by the FBI, and one is by the State Department. You could take a look at this and read this on your own. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because you can read it. Again, I do have a short video this week, and the short video deals with the idea of the 25 worst terrorist acts in the world, and it just goes back to show you the level of how long these type of activities have been taking place. It's pretty extensive from a historical perspective. Defining the war on terrorism. Our book goes into a little bit of detail on this in terms of defining the war on terrorism and what it is. It started obviously with President George W. Bush following 9/11, and he addressed the nation stating that America and its allies were in a war with terrorism. Now, this is despite the fact that the Constitution having no provision for declaring war on a concept, because remember, terrorism is a concept. It's not, we're not declaring war on a country. Basically, we're declaring war on a concept. So that in and of itself can cause some problems as we try to approach this whole idea of having a war on a specific concept. Now, President Barack Obama has redefined America's approach to terrorism as a criminal justice problem where military force is used to augment legal powers. So the critical difference here is that we, under President Obama, have gone from an approach of more of a militaristic approach to terrorism to it being a criminal justice approach to terrorism and how we approach and deal with acts of terrorism. Now, that doesn't mean that the military doesn't serve some function or role in terrorism, but the emphasis is to have it be part of the criminal justice process. And I'm going to end it here for part one.